The house was quiet, too quiet for a place so full of secrets. Ethan stood by the window watching the rain fall in steady sheets, each drop hitting the glass like the ticking of a countdown. Something was coming. He could feel it, a shadow lingering just out of reach. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear Mark's voice, that smooth, sickening charm that had taken over their home. How had it come to this? His mother, once strong, now a shell, blinded by love, or maybe just by loneliness. His sister, so trusting, so naive. And Sophie. He clenched his fists, the thought of Mark's smile directed at her twisting his stomach in knots. No, something wasn't right, and whatever it was, it would soon come crashing down. It had been nearly a year since his father's sudden death, but the grief hadn't eased, it had only taken a darker turn. His mother, Linda, had remarried quickly, too quickly. Mark, the charming and much younger man, had swept into their lives with a grin that never quite reached his eyes. He had started off subtle, blending into the background, but it didn't take long for Ethan to sense something was wrong. Mark was too perfect, too calculating, and always watching. Ethan turned away from the window and moved down the grand hallway, each step echoing through the silence of the old house. His mother's estate, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. It wasn't just the grief that hung in the air. It was the tension. Since Mark's arrival, everything had shifted. His mother, usually so composed, was anxious, as if afraid to lose her newfound security. Grace, his younger sister, had welcomed Mark with open arms, seeing him as a replacement for the father she lost. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was here for something more, something darker. He thought back to the whispers he had overheard. Rumors about Mark's past, about his string of wealthy women who had mysteriously fallen for him, and then just as mysteriously fallen apart. None of them could prove anything, but there was a pattern. One that Ethan was sure his mother was next in line for. Mark's charm had worked its way through their family like a slow poison, and no one seemed to see it, except for Ethan. The front door creaked open, and Ethan's heart jolted. He stepped back into the shadows, his breath shallow as he listened. It was late, too late for visitors. Footsteps padded down the hallway, soft but deliberate, and then he saw him. Mark. The man moved silently, his eyes scanning the house like a predator surveying its territory. Ethan held his breath as Mark paused, his head tilting as if he could sense someone was watching him. Ethan's pulse quickened. There was something different about Mark tonight. Something cold. His usual grin was gone, replaced by a look of impatience, even anger. Mark moved toward the living room, his hand brushing the edge of the staircase as he went. Ethan stayed hidden, watching with growing unease. Why was Mark so calm, so controlled, while the rest of them were unraveling? The answer, Ethan knew, lay in the man's eyes that were always calculating, always one step ahead. And tonight, they seemed darker than usual, like he was planning something. Ethan couldn't prove it, but he could feel it, deep in his bones. Mark wasn't just here for love or companionship. He was here for something else, and Ethan was determined to find out what it was before it was too late. Sophie had warned him not to jump to conclusions. But what did she know? She hadn't seen the way Mark looked at Grace when no one was paying attention, or how his hand lingered just a little too long on her shoulder during family dinners. And she certainly didn't know about the late-night phone calls Mark took in hushed tones, his voice full of promises that weren't meant for his wife. Ethan had followed him once, late at night, only to see him slip into a bar on the far side of town, laughing with a woman who wasn't his mother. Ethan's hands curled into fists as the memories flashed through his mind. Mark wasn't just a con man, he was a predator, circling his family, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But not if Ethan could help it. He wouldn't let Mark destroy what little they had left. Not his mother. Not his sister. Not Sophie. He had to act. But how? Every attempt to confront his mother had failed. She was too blinded by her grief and Mark's charm to see the truth. And Grace, she refused to believe anything bad about the man who had stepped into their father's shoes. Ethan was alone in this, trapped in a nightmare where the villain lived under his own roof. As the rain continued to pound against the window, Ethan made a silent vow. He would find out the truth. Whatever Mark was hiding, he would uncover it. Because the only way to protect his family was to expose the man for what he really was, before someone got hurt. Or worse. Mark disappeared into his study, and Ethan slipped back into his room, heart racing, mind spinning. Tonight had felt different. There was something dark hanging over the house, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the beginning. Something terrible was going to happen, something that would tear them all apart. And when it did, Ethan would be ready. He had to be. The next morning, Ethan's unease lingered like a shadow. The rain had stopped, but the air in the house felt thick, as though the storm had left something behind. He went through his usual routine, breakfast with his mother and sister, but the tension was palpable. Mark was unusually quiet, sipping his coffee with a distant expression, his eyes flicking up occasionally to observe the room. To anyone else, it would have seemed normal. But to Ethan, it was unsettling. Mark had always been good at hiding his true nature. He knew how to blend in, to charm people when it suited him. But lately, his mask had started to slip. Ethan caught the glances, the quick changes in expression when Mark thought no one was watching. And then there was the way he treated Grace. Ethan's sister had always been innocent, trusting. Too trusting for her own good. She saw Mark as a father figure, someone who had stepped in to fill the void left by their dad's death. But Ethan knew better. He could see the way Mark looked at her, the way his hand lingered on her arm just a second too long, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when she was around. "Ethan, you're quiet this morning," Linda said, glancing at him from across the table. His mother's voice was soft, almost distracted, as though she were trying to smooth over the cracks in their lives with polite conversation. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. But he wasn't fine. Every instinct in his body told him something was wrong. Grace looked up from her plate. "You're not mad about last night, are you?" "Mad about what?" Ethan asked, feigning ignorance. He knew exactly what she was talking about. "Mark offered to help me with the car. You didn't look too happy about it." Ethan clenched his jaw. He hadn't liked the idea of Mark being alone with Grace, especially when she'd asked him to teach her some basic repairs. The thought of his sister spending time with that man made his skin crawl. "I'm just tired," he said, not wanting to argue. "Not yet, anyway." Mark smiled, that practiced, easy grin that seemed to fool everyone but Ethan. "Don't worry, Ethan. I'd never let anything happen to Grace, you know that." There it was again, that slimy charm, that hidden edge to his words. Ethan fought the urge to slam his fist on the table. Instead, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'll be out for a while," he muttered, walking away before anyone could question him further. He needed space, time to think. Being in the same room as Mark made his blood boil. As he left the house, Ethan's mind raced. He had spent weeks watching, waiting for the moment when he could finally expose Mark for what he was. But every time he thought he had something solid, the man would slip out of his grasp, leaving behind only suspicion and frustration. Ethan headed to the garage, the one place in the house where he could be alone. The smell of motor oil and rusted metal greeted him. A familiar comfort in the midst of chaos. He sank onto an old stool, his eyes falling on the tools scattered across the workbench. His mind wandered back to the moment he had first felt something was wrong. Months ago, when he had overheard Mark's phone conversation late one night. Ethan had been coming back from a friend's house when he had seen Mark pacing in the backyard, speaking in hushed tones. The words had been muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Mark had been talking to someone about money. And not just any money, but money owed. Ethan hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, after everything that had happened, that conversation played over and over in his head. Who had Mark been talking to? And why was he so secretive about it? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Sophie stood at the doorway, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. "You okay?" she asked, stepping inside. Ethan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking." Sophie crossed her arms, leaning against the garage wall. "You've been doing a lot of that lately?" He shrugged. "Something feels off, Soph. I can't shake the feeling that Mark's up to something." Sophie sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Look, I know you don't like him, but don't you think you're being a little paranoid? I mean, the guy hasn't done anything wrong." Ethan scoffed. "That's the problem. He's too perfect, too calculated. You weren't there last night, Sophie. The way he looks at Grace, It's not right. Sophie frowned. You think he's interested in her? I don't know, Ethan admitted, his voice low. But I'm not taking any chances. There's something off about him, I can feel it. Sophie bit her lip, her eyes searching his face. Have you talked to your mom about it? Ethan shook his head. She won't listen. She's too wrapped up in her own grief. And Grace, she practically worships the guy. Sophie sighed again, pushing off the wall. Just be careful, okay? Don't do anything stupid. Ethan nodded, but deep down, he knew that caution alone wouldn't be enough. Something had to be done. Mark had wormed his way into their lives, and if Ethan didn't act soon, he feared the damage would be irreversible. As Sophie left, Ethan's gaze fell on a toolbox in the corner. A cold thought entered his mind, one he had been trying to push away for weeks. If no one else would stop Mark, maybe it was up to him. But how far was he willing to go? His hand hovered over the tools for a moment before he pulled it back, shaking off the idea. He wasn't that desperate. Not yet. But as the hours passed and the rain began to fall again, Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. The pieces were all there, scattered across the puzzle of his life. He just needed to figure out how they fit together before it was too late. And somewhere in the distance, in the darkened corners of the estate, the clock was ticking. The air in the house had grown heavy, like the calm before a storm. Ethan couldn't ignore the growing tension between him and Mark any longer. It wasn't just his discomfort or his suspicions. It was something deeper, more insidious, crawling under the surface of their interactions. The facade that Mark had worked so hard to maintain was starting to crack, and Ethan could see through it, even if no one else could. The catalyst, though, came one afternoon in the form of a small, innocuous event, one that would set off a chain reaction, leading to the unraveling of everything Ethan had known. It began when Ethan returned home early from work. He'd left a project unfinished, and decided to spend the afternoon catching up. But as he entered the front door, the unmistakable sound of muffled voices caught his attention. The house was usually quiet during the day. His mother would be out shopping or having tea with friends, and Grace had class. He moved quietly through the hallway, his heart pounding as he recognized one of the voices. It was Mark. And the other? He wasn't sure yet, but something about the tone set off alarm bells in his mind. Ethan's footsteps slowed as he approached the living room. From behind the half-closed door, he could make out part of the conversation. Mark's voice was smooth, oozing with his usual charm, but there was an edge to it, something almost threatening in the way he spoke. I've taken care of everything, Mark was saying. Just like we agreed. You'll get your cut once the paperwork goes through. A second voice answered, a woman's voice, sharp and impatient. I want more, Mark. You promised me more. Do you think I'm stupid? You've been pocketing a lot more than you let on. Ethan's hand froze on the doorknob, his breath caught in his throat. Who was this woman? And what were they talking about? Before he could stop himself, he leaned closer, trying to catch more of the conversation. I've got it under control, Mark replied, his voice tense now, defensive. You'll get what you're owed. Just don't mess this up. We're almost there. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He couldn't make sense of all the pieces yet, but it was clear that Mark was hiding something. Something big. His mind raced as he considered the implications. Was Mark embezzling money? Was he conning his mother too? But before he could think further, a sudden creak echoed through the hallway. Ethan cursed under his breath as he realized he had accidentally leaned against the door, causing it to shift. The voices inside the room stopped abruptly, and in an instant, he heard Mark's footsteps approaching the door. Ethan barely had time to react before the door swung open. Mark stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing in suspicion as he caught sight of Ethan. "What are you doing home?" Mark asked, his voice strained but attempting to maintain its usual calm. The tension between them was palpable now, like two predators circling one another. "I could ask you the same thing," Ethan shot back, his eyes flicking over Mark's shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman in the room. But whoever she was gone. Mark's smile was thin, forced. "Just handling some business, nothing for you to worry about." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't believe a word of it, but he wasn't ready to confront Mark, not yet. He needed more, he needed proof. "Is that what you call it? Business?" Mark's eyes flashed, and for a brief second, Ethan saw something dark, something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. Mark stepped aside, his hand gesturing toward the living room. "Feel free to check, Ethan. But like I said, nothing for you to worry about." Ethan hesitated, then stepped into the room. It was empty, just as he had suspected. But there was a faint scent of perfume in the air, one that definitely didn't belong to his mother. He glanced around, but there was no sign of the mysterious woman. She was long gone. "You might want to trust me more," Mark said from behind him, his voice carrying a warning. "I'm not the enemy here." Ethan turned slowly to face him, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, his voice cold. But inside, his anger was boiling over. He left the house without another word, his mind racing with the new information. Who was this woman? And what sort of deal had Mark been making behind their backs? Ethan knew one thing for sure. He needed to find out what Mark was up to, and fast. That evening, Ethan met up with Sophie at their usual spot, a small cafe near the edge of town. The rain had started again, light droplets tapping against the window as he sat across from her, trying to make sense of what he'd overheard. "So let me get this straight," Sophie said, leaning forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You think Mark's been scheming behind your mom's back? With some woman?" Ethan nodded, his fingers drumming against the table anxiously. "I'm sure of it, I just don't know what they're up to. But it's bad, I can feel it." Sophie sighed, running a hand through her hair. "This is insane. Have you told your mom?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet, I don't have any proof, and even if I did, she wouldn't believe me. She's completely blind when it comes to him." Sophie frowned, her expression thoughtful. "So what are you gonna do?" "I'm gonna find out who this woman is," Ethan said, his voice firm. "And I'm gonna figure out what Mark's planning. He's not getting away with this." But even as he said the words, a chill ran down his spine. Something told him that whatever Mark was involved in, it was bigger than Ethan had imagined. And the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. As the rain intensified outside, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Mark was one step ahead of him, waiting in the shadows. The catalyst had been set in motion, and there was no turning back now. All Ethan knew for sure was that things were about to get a lot worse. The days following Ethan's encounter with Mark passed in a blur of tension and unease. Every time they were in the same room, Ethan could feel the invisible battle lines drawn between them. Mark was always watching him, with that smug grin that made Ethan's blood boil. But behind the grin, Ethan could sense something darker. Something calculating. Ethan couldn't shake the conversation he had overheard. The mysterious woman, the vague promises, the scent of deception hung in the air like a noxious cloud. His gut told him that something bad was coming, and it was coming fast. He just didn't know what, until one fateful night when everything began to unravel. It started innocently enough. Ethan had been out late with Sophie, trying to distract himself from the creeping paranoia that had been gnawing at him. They had walked through the park, talked about the future, about their plans, but Mark was always there, lurking in the back of his mind. By the time Ethan returned home, the house was quiet. His mother had already gone to bed, and Grace was out with friends. Only Mark remained, sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey like he always did after dark. The flickering glow of the television cast shadows across the room, and for a moment Ethan considered slipping past unnoticed. But then, Mark's voice cut through the silence, low and slurred. "Late night?" Ethan froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face him. Mark was sprawled across the couch, his shirt unbuttoned, the glass dangling loosely from his hand. There was something different about him tonight, something more menacing, as if the mask he usually wore had slipped just enough for Ethan to see the monster beneath. "Yeah, just out with Sophie," Ethan replied, keeping his tone neutral. But inside, his heart was racing. He didn't like the way Mark was looking at him, as if he knew something Ethan didn't. Mark's lips curled into a crooked smile. "Sophie? She's a sweet girl, smart too, pretty." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yeah, she is." Mark took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "You know, it's funny, I've been thinking a lot lately about how fragile things are, how quickly life can change." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he didn't respond. He wasn't sure if Mark was just drunk or if there was something more to what he was saying. Mark set the glass down on the coffee table with a sharp clink, his eyes narrowing as they bored into Ethan's. "Your mother. She trusts me, you know? She trusts me with everything." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to lash out, to scream that his mother was a fool for trusting Mark, but he held back. He couldn't lose control. Not yet. "You should be careful, Ethan," Mark continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You never know what people are capable of when their backs are against the wall." And just like that, the tension snapped. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. "What are you trying to say, Mark? Are you threatening me?" Mark's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Threatening you? No. I'm just giving you some friendly advice." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Friendly advice, huh? Like the kind you gave to that woman you were meeting behind my mother's back?" For a moment, Mark's expression faltered, and Ethan saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. Mark leaned back against the couch, laughing softly. "You really have no idea what you're getting yourself into, do you?" Ethan's chest tightened. "I know enough. I know you're a liar and a cheat, and I know you're going to ruin my mother if you haven't already." Mark's laughter stopped abruptly, and for the first time, there was real menace in his eyes. "You don't know anything, kid, but you're about to find out." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. There was something about the way Mark said it, something final, like a promise of what was to come. And for the first time, Ethan felt real fear. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached the hallway, he heard Mark's voice one last time, soft but full of menace. "Watch your back, Ethan." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The confrontation with Mark had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. Mark was planning something big, and Ethan needed to stop him before it was too late. The next day, Ethan put his plan into motion. He skipped work, choosing instead to follow Mark, hoping to catch him in the act of whatever scheme he was plotting. For hours, Ethan trailed him through the city, watching as Mark moved through his usual routine, meetings with shady-looking businessmen, phone calls in hushed voices, exchanges of envelopes that made Ethan's skin crawl. But it wasn't until the afternoon that Ethan's suspicions were finally confirmed. He watched from across the street as Mark entered a small, run-down office building on the edge of town. A few minutes later, a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the woman from the house, the one Mark had been meeting with the night Ethan overheard them. Ethan's heart raced as he watched them talk, their voices too low to hear from his position. But the body language was clear. They were arguing, and it was heated. Mark was gesturing wildly, and the woman was pointing at him accusingly. Ethan couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was obvious that the deal was falling apart. Suddenly, the woman turned and stormed off, disappearing into the busy street. Mark stood there for a moment, his expression dark and furious, before he, too, left in the opposite direction. Ethan didn't know the details of what had just happened, but one thing was clear. Mark was getting desperate. Whatever game he was playing, it was unraveling fast, and Ethan knew that desperation would make Mark dangerous. As Ethan watched Mark's figure disappear down the street, he realized that he was running out of time. If he didn't act soon, Mark would take everything. His mother's wealth, their family's peace, and maybe even more. And that's when the plan formed in Ethan's mind. The plan that would change everything. It was simple, really. A few tweaks to Mark's car, a little tampering with the tie rod, and no one would ever know. It would look like a tragic accident. No one would suspect him. Not even Mark. The thought terrified Ethan, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, he felt in control. He was ready to end this, once and for all. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Ethan knew that tonight would be the night. Tonight, he would put his plan into action. And tomorrow, Mark would be gone. The night was heavy with an eerie stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ethan stood in the driveway, the cool breeze brushing against his skin as he looked at the sleek, black car parked under the dim glow of the garage light. Mark's car. The machine that would be his undoing. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he crouched beside the vehicle, his heart thudding in his chest. The tools he had carefully gathered lay beside him, glinting in the faint light. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and cold determination. Could he really do this? Could he tamper with the car and orchestrate the death of another human being, even someone as loathsome as Mark? He tried to push those thoughts aside. This wasn't about murder, he told himself. This was about protection. Protecting his mother, his sister, and Sophie from a man who was destroying their lives. A man who had no qualms about using people for his own selfish gains. A man who had crossed every line and wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. Mark's flirtations with his girlfriend, the inappropriate advances toward Grace, the lies, the manipulation, all of it came crashing down on Ethan like a tidal wave of rage. He had tried everything, confrontations, warnings, even following Mark to gather dirt on him, but nothing had worked. Mark was untouchable. But not tonight. Ethan slid under the car, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts, as he worked quickly, loosening the tie rod just enough to make the steering unreliable. His hands moved mechanically, the steps playing out in his mind like a rehearsed dance. He had studied the car's structure, made sure he understood how to cause the failure without it looking suspicious. A small malfunction, enough to send Mark's car spiraling out of control when he hit a certain speed. It was easy, too easy. Within minutes, the job was done. Ethan wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and crawled out from under the car, his heart racing as he packed up his tools. He felt the weight of what he had done press down on him, but there was no turning back now. Mark's fate was sealed. The house was quiet when Ethan slipped inside. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight and Mark hadn't returned yet from his evening out. Good, Ethan thought. That gave him some time to calm his nerves and plan his next move. As he made his way to the kitchen, he spotted a dim light coming from the living room. His mother was still awake, sitting on the couch with a book in her lap, her face etched with tiredness and worry. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He could feel the weight of guilt creeping into his chest as he looked at her, knowing what he had just done. But then he reminded himself. He was doing this for her. For the family. Ethan? His mother's voice broke through his thoughts. I didn't hear you come in. Ethan forced a smile and walked over to her, sitting down on the edge of the couch. Yeah, I was just out for a walk, couldn't sleep. She gave him a sad smile and closed her book. I know it's been hard, with Mark and everything. I just want you to know that I'm trying to keep things together. I know he's difficult, but... He's more than difficult, Mom, Ethan interrupted, the bitterness in his voice sharper than he intended. He's dangerous. You have no idea what he's capable of. His mother's face fell, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I know he has his flaws, but we've been through so much already. I can't go through another loss. Ethan's throat tightened. You won't have to. Before his mother could respond, the sound of an approaching car cut through the quiet. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he stood up, his pulse quickening as the familiar growl of Mark's car engine rumbled in the driveway. This was it. Mark had arrived. Ethan's mother glanced toward the window. Mark's back, she said softly, and there was something in her voice, maybe exhaustion, maybe hope. But Ethan didn't have time to dwell on it. I'm going to bed, Ethan said quickly, heading toward the stairs. He didn't want to be around when Mark came inside. He couldn't look at him, not now, knowing what was about to happen. As Ethan reached the top of the stairs, he paused, listening to the front door open. He could hear Mark's footsteps as he entered the house, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. Any minute now, he thought, it would all be over soon. The next morning, the sound of sirens shattered the early morning calm. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat breakfast, though his appetite had vanished. His mother had already left for work, and Grace was still asleep upstairs. Everything seemed normal, but there was an unbearable weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. He had hardly slept, his mind racing with anxiety about what had happened. When the sirens grew louder, Ethan rushed to the window, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the flashing lights of a police car and an ambulance speeding down the street. They stopped just a few blocks away, at the exact spot where Mark usually turned onto the highway. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He knew. Somehow, he just knew. Grabbing his jacket, he bolted out of the house and ran toward the scene, his heart racing faster with every step. As he neared the crash site, the scene came into view. Mark's car, crumpled and smoking, had veered off the road and slammed into a tree. Paramedics were already working frantically, but Ethan knew it was too late. The car was totaled. He stood frozen, watching from a distance as they pulled Mark's lifeless body from the wreckage. His chest tightened, the world spinning around him. The plan had worked. Too well. The realization hit him like a freight train. Mark was dead. And it wasn't an accident. Ethan's hands shook as he backed away, his mind a chaotic blur of emotions, relief, horror, guilt. He had done it. He had ended the nightmare, but at what cost? As the police cordoned off the area, Ethan slipped away, unnoticed by the crowd gathering around the crash. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs weak beneath him as he staggered back home. The adrenaline that had fueled him all night drained from his body, leaving him feeling hollow and numb. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Mark was dead. And Ethan had made sure of it. Ethan could hardly concentrate in the days following the accident. Life in the house had changed overnight. Grief hung heavily in the air, clinging to the walls like a persistent fog. His mother moved through the motions of her daily routine with a dazed expression, her laughter replaced by a quiet sadness. Grace had become more withdrawn, often retreating to her room, and Ethan found himself caught between wanting to comfort his family and the gnawing fear of what might happen if the truth came to light. The news of Mark's death spread through the community like wildfire. The media descended upon the small town, their cameras capturing every tearful moment of the funeral and every whispered rumor about the man whose life had ended in a tragic accident. Ethan watched it all unfold with a sense of detachment, a numbness settling over him as he struggled to reconcile his actions with the grief surrounding him. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that the phone rang. The shrill sound echoed through the quiet house, making Ethan jump. He exchanged a worried glance with Grace, who was curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the television. He answered the call, a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. "Ethan?" The voice on the other end was familiar. "Detective Harris, the lead investigator on Mark's case. I need to speak with you. Can you come to the station?" Yeah, of course," Ethan stammered, his heart racing. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause before the detective replied. "We have a few questions we'd like to go over regarding Mark's accident. I think it's important for you to come in." "I'll be there," Ethan said, forcing his voice to remain steady before hanging up. He felt as if the walls were closing in on him. Had they found something? Did they suspect him? When he arrived at the police station, the sterile smell of coffee and paper hit him as he stepped through the door. Detective Harris was waiting for him in a small interview room, a serious expression on his face. He motioned for Ethan to sit down, and the tension in the air thickened as the door clicked shut behind him. "Thank you for coming in," Harris said, his voice calm yet authoritative. "I know this is a difficult time for you, but we need to ask some questions about your stepfather." Ethan nodded, trying to appear composed. "Okay, let's start with the night of the accident," Harris began, leaning forward slightly. "Can you tell me where you were at that time?" Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't afford any slip-ups. "I was at home. Just relaxing after a long day. I didn't see him leave." "Did you notice anything unusual about Mark's behavior that night? Any arguments? Tension in the house?" Could hear their harsh words echoing in his mind, the way Mark would belittle her, but he had to keep it vague. "No, nothing out of the ordinary. He was just himself." The detective studied him closely, his gaze penetrating. "You know, we've spoken to several of Mark's acquaintances. There were whispers about him and some unsavory connections, relationships that didn't end well. He had a history with some wealthy women, and they're not exactly taking his death lightly." Ethan's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "Some of these women are quite upset, claiming Mark stole from them. We've received threats from a couple of them, saying they want answers, Harris explained. We're just trying to piece things together. Did Mark ever mention anyone specific? Ethan shook his head, panic beginning to rise within him. Not to me. I didn't really talk to him much. We didn't get along. Right? Harris said, jotting down notes. But what about his relationships? You wouldn't happen to know if he was seeing anyone else? Ethan's pulse quickened. No. He was married to my mother, and that's all I know. The detective leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I see. Well, it's crucial we get to the bottom of this, Ethan. We found something at the scene that may help us understand what happened. There were traces of alcohol in Mark's system, but we also found something else, a trace of poison. Ethan's heart dropped. Poison? Are you sure? Absolutely. It's not something that can be easily dismissed, Harris replied, his voice steady. It suggests that someone had a motive to harm him. If you know anything? I don't, Ethan interrupted, the fear spilling over. I swear, I don't know anything about it. All right, Harris said, his tone softer now. But if you do remember anything, it's important you come to us. We're just trying to keep everyone safe. As Ethan left the station, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His heart raced as he considered the implications of the detective's words. Poison? Could Mark have been murdered? And if so, by whom? He knew he had to act quickly. The investigation was closing in, and he needed to protect himself, but more importantly, he needed to protect Grace and their mother. As the shadows lengthened across the town, Ethan realized that the truth was far more complicated than he had anticipated. Secrets lurked in every corner, and he was about to be drawn deeper into a web of deceit, betrayal, and danger. As he drove home, the looming question nagged at him. Was he truly safe, or had he only set off a chain of events that would expose his darkest secret? The days following Detective Harris's unsettling visit blurred together in a haze of anxiety and dread. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of the poison, of the implications it had on the circumstances surrounding Mark's death. What if someone had really killed him? What if the truth came out, and he was implicated? The atmosphere at home was suffocating. His mother moved like a ghost, her eyes red and swollen from crying, while Grace barely spoke at all. Ethan felt the walls closing in, and the only thing that provided any semblance of relief was the presence of his girlfriend, Lily. But even their moments together were tinged with an unspoken fear that loomed over them. One evening, Ethan found himself sitting on the front porch, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long shadows across the yard. The cool breeze did little to soothe his frayed nerves. He had been restless all day, unable to shake the feeling that the police were on to something more than they were letting on. Lily arrived shortly after, her face lighting up as she approached him. "Hey, I brought you something," she said, holding up a small container of cookies. "Thought you could use a treat." He managed a weak smile, but the weight of the past week hung heavily on him. "Thanks, but I'm not really hungry," he admitted, staring down at his hands. "Ethan, you look terrible," she said, her brow furrowing with concern. "You need to talk to me. What's going on?" Taking a deep breath, he finally opened up. "It's just everything since Mark died. I can't stop thinking about it. I mean, he wasn't a great guy, but he didn't deserve to die like that. And now with the police investigation, they're looking at me." "Why would they look at you?" Lily asked, her voice softening. "You didn't do anything." He hesitated, the truth hanging heavy on his tongue, but the urge to confide in her was too strong to resist. "They found traces of poison at the scene, and it's just made me think about everything. I can't shake the feeling that something more sinister is at play here. I'm terrified they'll find out what I did." Lily's eyes widened as she took in his words. "What do you mean, what you did?" He swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I was angry at Mark. I wanted him out of our lives. He was hurting our family, and I couldn't take it anymore. I thought if I could just scare him a little, maybe he'd stop." "But Ethan, that's serious," she whispered, concern etched across her features. "What did you do?" Ethan felt the weight of his confession hanging in the air. He took a deep breath, preparing to unravel the truth that had been suffocating him. I poisoned his drink, just a little, enough to make him sick. I thought it would scare him into behaving. I never meant for him to die, Lily. Shock washed over her face, and Ethan braced himself for her reaction. But instead of anger, he saw something different. Fear mingled with compassion. "Ethan, you didn't know it would end like this," she said softly. "You were just trying to protect your family." "I know that now," he replied, tears brimming in his eyes, "but the guilt is eating me alive. What if they find out? What if they think I'm responsible for his death?" "Ethan, listen to me," Lily said urgently, taking his hands in hers. "You need to tell the truth. If the police are looking into this, they'll find out eventually. You can't carry this burden alone. You have to be honest." The gravity of her words hit him like a freight train. He had been trying to protect his family, but in doing so, he had plunged himself into a deeper hole of deceit. The thought of confessing to the police terrified him, but the weight of his secret felt unbearable. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What if they don't believe me? What if they think I wanted him dead?" "Ethan, you were in a dark place, and you acted out of desperation. That doesn't mean you're a murderer. It means you're human," Lily replied, squeezing his hands tighter. "You need to clear your conscience, for your sake and for your family." The resolve in her voice resonated within him, igniting a flicker of courage. He knew what he had to do. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone and dialed the police station's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest. When Detective Harris answered, Ethan's throat tightened. "Detective, it's Ethan. I need to talk to you. It's important. I think I have something to confess." "All right, Ethan, can you come in?" Harris asked, his voice calm and steady. "Yeah, I'll be there soon," Ethan said, his stomach twisting with anxiety as he hung up. As he stood up from the porch, he glanced at Lily, whose eyes were filled with encouragement. "You can do this," she said softly. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the truth that was about to unravel. With each step toward the police station, he felt a mix of fear and relief. He was ready to confront the darkness within him, ready to confess and seek redemption, no matter the cost. The truth would finally see the light of day, and perhaps, in the end, it would free him from the shadows of guilt that had haunted him since Mark's tragic death. The police station loomed before Ethan, its sterile facade and harsh lights casting long shadows across the parking lot. His heart raced as he pushed through the glass doors, the familiar smell of coffee and paper mingling in the air, but the warmth of the surroundings did little to comfort him. He felt like a condemned man walking toward his fate, each step heavier than the last. Detective Harris greeted him with a nod, gesturing for him to follow him into a small interrogation room. The walls were painted a dull gray, adorned with a single flickering fluorescent light above. A table sat in the center, flanked by 2 chairs, and Ethan's stomach churned at the sight. "Take a seat," Harris instructed, his tone steady but serious. "You mentioned you had something important to discuss." Ethan nodded, his palms sweating as he settled into the hard chair. I want to confess," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "About Mark." The detective's expression shifted slightly, a mix of curiosity and concern. "Go on," he encouraged, leaning forward as if he were bracing himself for the weight of Ethan's words. Taking a deep breath, Ethan plunged into his confession. He recounted the events leading up to Mark's death, the anger that had festered within him, and the desperate decision he had made to protect his family. Each word felt like a stone falling into a deep well, echoing endlessly in the silence of the room. "I thought I could scare him into leaving us alone," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I never wanted him to die. I just wanted him to stop hurting us." As he spoke, Ethan could see the flicker of understanding in Harris's eyes, but it was overshadowed by a heavy sense of reality. "Ethan, this is serious," the detective said, his voice calm but firm. "What you did was illegal, and it resulted in Mark's death. You need to understand the gravity of your actions." "I know," Ethan replied, tears pooling in his eyes. "I'm willing to accept the consequences. I just want my family to be safe. I was trying to protect them from him." Detective Harris sat back in his chair, folding his arms. "Your intentions, while understandable, don't absolve you of the law. The death of your stepfather will be investigated thoroughly, and your confession will play a crucial role in that process." The weight of those words settled heavily in the air, and Ethan felt a deep sense of despair wash over him. He had hoped that by confessing, he might somehow find redemption. But the reality of the situation was far harsher than he had anticipated. Days turned into weeks as the investigation unfolded, the story of Mark's death capturing the attention of the community. Ethan's confession made headlines, and the family found themselves at the center of a storm. With each article, Ethan felt the walls closing in around him, the burden of his choices crashing down like a tidal wave. His mother was devastated, unable to comprehend the full extent of what had transpired. Grace, too, struggled to reconcile her feelings about the man they had lost and the brother who had betrayed their family's trust. The dynamic within their household shifted irreparably, the air heavy with unspoken grief and guilt. Ethan's relationship with Lily, once a source of joy and comfort, began to fray. The love they had shared was now burdened with the weight of his confession and the fallout that followed. Lily stood by him, but he could see the pain etched on her face, the way she grappled with the reality of what he had done. During a late-night conversation, she spoke softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "Ethan, I love you, but I can't pretend everything is okay. You need to find a way to forgive yourself." Her words pierced through him like a knife. He realized that the cost of his protection had not only been Mark's life, but also the fragility of his family and his own sense of self. He had acted out of fear and anger, but the consequences had spiraled far beyond what he had ever intended. As the trial approached, Ethan prepared himself for the inevitable. He understood that he would face judgment, not just from the court, but from the very people he had sought to protect. The price of his actions weighed heavily on his heart, and he was ready to face the music. The courtroom was tense as Ethan sat in the witness stand, his face pale but resolute. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air. The judge gestured for him to continue, and all eyes were on him, waiting for an explanation that would either condemn or justify his actions. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice low but clear. "I did what I did because I had no choice. Mark, my stepfather, he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. Behind his charming smile was a predator. He was obsessed with power and control, and he used his wealth to prey on the vulnerable." His eyes darted across the courtroom to his sister, who sat tearfully beside their mother. "My sister. She trusted him. She thought he cared for her, but I knew better. I saw the way he looked at her, the way his eyes followed her every move, as if she was just another prize for him to conquer." Ethan paused, his voice thick with emotion. "And then there was my girlfriend. She didn't tell me at first. She was scared, embarrassed maybe, but I saw it, the same look of fear in her eyes when Mark was around. I couldn't let him destroy her too. Every time he came over, every time he even glanced at her, I could feel the danger in the air. He would make subtle comments, brush against her, and linger just long enough to make her uncomfortable. She tried to brush it off, but I knew, I saw it." He looked directly at the jury, pleading for them to understand. "I didn't think it was safe for them anymore. Mark had already taken advantage of so many women, using them, discarding them when they were no longer useful. He thought he could do the same to my sister, to my girlfriend. I had to protect them. They didn't deserve to live in fear, to constantly be on guard in their own home." Ethan's voice wavered, but he continued. "I know what I did was wrong. I tampered with the car. I made sure he wouldn't hurt anyone again. But I wasn't trying to be a killer. I was trying to save the people I loved from a monster who hid behind a facade of respectability. If I could have stopped him another way, I would have, but I was desperate. I couldn't live with the thought of what he might do next." He lowered his head, his final words barely above a whisper. "I didn't think there was any other way." The courtroom fell silent. The judge, the jury, and the spectators were all absorbing the gravity of his confession. Ethan's actions, driven by love and protection, had led him down a path from which there was no turning back. He had destroyed a life to save two others, but in the process, he had destroyed his own. The verdict would come, but for Ethan, the true punishment was already clear. The cost of protection was far higher than he had ever imagined. Please like the video and subscribe the channel, and click on bell icon.